Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Jocelyn Forbush, the Chief Conservation Officer at Mass Audubon, and I want to thank you all for joining us to learn more about our ambitious work along the Massachusetts coast, one of the most vital areas for nature and biodiversity in our state, but of course, one that is also deeply beloved by so many of us. We are thrilled by the tremendous interest in this webinar. Tonight, we are joined by already several hundred of you, Mass Audubon members, friends, and supporters from around the Commonwealth and beyond. You're reporting in from the Berkshires, Central Mass, Metro West communities, and of course from our coastal regions. I see folks from the North and South Shores, Greater Boston, the South Coast, the islands, and also a few folks from our states to the north and the south along the coast. So welcome all. We are grateful for your choosing to spend this time with us to explore some of the most pressing issues facing coastal biodiversity and the health of our natural systems here in Massachusetts. And I'm excited for you to hear the hope, the expertise, and the action that our team at Mass Audubon and our partners are bringing to address these challenges. Before the presentation begins, I just want to note a couple things about the webinar, a little bit of housekeeping. First, it is being recorded, and we will share the recording link with you all via email later this week. Second, I want to thank those of you who sent us questions about the coast in advance, and we'll try to answer as many of those as we can at the end of our presentation tonight. For those of you who'd like to send us questions live, we do have the chat function turned off, but you can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And lastly, fun feature for this evening, feel free to use the reactions button tonight as topics, as learnings resonate with you, inspire you. Your reactions and feedback inspire us all. So you see a few there up on the screen already. And so with that, let me turn to this evening's program. And I want to turn first to the title of our webinar this evening, which is Conservation Edge, Advancing Resilience on Our Coast. Now, this is a play on words, and it illustrates a couple of different perspectives that we can take on the coast. Now, the first is a literal version. Our coast is the edge. It's the place where land meets the sea. As such, it is the interface of dynamic, ever-changing set of ecological systems. Secondly, and figuratively, our title speaks to the reality that the future health of our coast is on the edge. It is facing new and more complex threats, and we are part of a broad stretch of coastline from southern New England up into the Gulf of Maine, where our coastal zones are seeing sea levels rise, changing 3 to 4 times faster than the global average. And this is confounding an increasingly complex set of threats that are reshaping the shoreline at an unprecedented rate. Yet this same coast, our very own Massachusetts coast, is a globally significant landscape, and it supports an extraordinary biodiversity, including many iconic species that, as you all know, are already experiencing steep rates of decline. And because so many people, communities, local economies depend on this narrow stretch where land meets the sea, the health of our coast is inseparable from the health of both nature and our way of life. So this leads me to my last play on words, which is Mass Audubon's Conservation Edge. As New England's leading conservation organization and fiercest advocate for nature, we are uniquely positioned to address these challenges that are threatening the future of our coast. As stewards of thousands of coastal acres on 47 coastal wildlife sanctuaries in 27 coastal communities, Mass Audubon has an unparalleled experience as a trusted conservation partner, as a neighbor, as scientists, as educators, advocates, and as leaders at the local, state, and regional levels on coastal issues and coastal actions. For decades, as you all know, we have protected, stewarded, supported access to an unbelievably exceptional network of coastal sanctuaries. and have led innovative coastal restoration and management projects. Many of you may know the restoration of coastal wetlands in former cranberry bogs, such as our beautiful Tidmarsh Wildlife Sanctuary, which you see here. It's down in Plymouth. Our leadership in protecting our most threatened coastal species through research, through applied science and monitoring, impactful citizen science programs that many of you participate in, through education programs and advocacy, has produced success stories that are really unmatched in this region. So perhaps it won't surprise you to learn that Mass Audubon's action agenda, our 5-year strategic plan, places coastal work at the center of our efforts to confront the 3 urgent challenges of our moment: climate change, biodiversity loss, and the inequitable access to nature. Our current action agenda plan focuses on building a resilient and biodiverse coast, one that can absorb change, that can recover from storms, can support thriving wildlife and ecosystems, and can protect our communities. And we're aiming to do this all at an unprecedented, accelerated pace. We know that biodiversity and resilience are inseparable. Healthy, diverse wildlife populations depend on resilient habitats, and biodiversity loss is both a symptom and a driver of our declining coastal resilience. As is always true with nature, everything is interconnected. So tonight we want to share with you a little bit about how our team at Mass Audubon is tackling our challenges on the coast. And in particular, our presenters this evening will focus on the 4 areas of work that you see here on our screen. We want to talk with you about landscape restoration and land protection, our species protection work, our research and monitoring efforts, and then the advocacy and policy actions that are driving all of our coastal goals. So at this point, I am really thrilled to turn over the program to tonight's presenters, 2 of Mass Audubon's conservation leaders. I'll introduce them both to you first here. And so starting with Sarah Grady, who has been working in coastal Massachusetts on salt marshes for over 25 years and in ecological restoration specifically for over 20 years. At Mass Audubon, her work as senior coastal ecologist focuses on restoring coastal wetlands with a particular emphasis on salt marshes, from site-specific restoration to the design of a statewide assessment of marsh condition and migration potential that you're going to hear a little bit more about tonight. Joining Sarah is Lyra Brennan, who is the director of Mass Audubon's Coastal Waterbird Program. For over a decade, Lyra has focused on shorebird and seabird management, research, and conservation. Lyra's areas of special interest include habitat restoration, coastal resilience, and the recruitment of diverse beach users in support of conservation. I am really thrilled for you to meet and hear from these 2 exceptional colleagues of mine. And so at this point, I'm going to turn over to Sarah Grady to start us off with an exploration of our work in landscape restoration and protection. Sarah, welcome, and over to you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Jocelyn. So we know that our coasts are facing multiple threats. Some of these are environmental and climate drivers. For example, sea level rise and higher astronomical tides that are reshaping our salt marshes, intensifying storms that are altering dunes and beaches, and warming and acidifying waters that impact marine life and food webs. Other threats come from human and development pressures. Coastal development limits habitat movement, and hard infrastructure alters natural sediment flow. Pollution, especially from nutrients, is causing water quality issues on our coast, not to mention the threats to humans that are living close to the coast. We'd like to know, which coastal threats worry you the most? Is it hard infrastructure, intensifying storms, residential development, commercial development, sea level rise, pollution and water quality, or warming and acidifying waters? Let's give it a moment as we gather your votes. All right, so the votes are coming in, and we're seeing, unsurprisingly, sea level rise kind of taking the lead. I don't want to bias anybody here, but otherwise relatively equal. All right, we've got about 2/3 of people participating here so far. And it looks like the voting has kind of slowed down. And unsurprisingly, sea level rise concerns a lot of people, followed by pollution and water quality, and then almost a tie between intensifying storms and residential and commercial development. So we will talk about sea level rise. Thank you so much for voting. So these are urgent issues, but it is possible to do something. For both restoration and protection on the coast, we look to the places at the nexus of urgency, possibility, and ecological value. What might we lose that we can save with action right now? Ecological restoration is the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that has been damaged, degraded, or destroyed. We restore ecosystems for many different reasons and benefits, and restoration and protection are at the core of resilience. A majority of our coastal landscape level action at Mass Audubon is focused on salt marshes. Massachusetts has lost about 41% of its salt marsh since about 1800. Salt marshes need elevation, vegetation, and sediment to have a chance to keep pace with sea level rise. Historic agricultural practices have fractured how water moves across and through our salt marshes, which leads to loss of elevation and vegetation stress. The good news is that we are learning how to help our marshes heal and grow. The bad news is that the clock is ticking. There are almost 50,000 acres of salt marsh alone in Massachusetts. How do we triage? Well, I'll bring you back to the concepts of urgency, possibility, and desirability. Our goals and priorities focus on places that need help now, but that are possible to save, and where we can get the most benefit for habitat and ecosystem health. We want to restore and protect as much as we can and help all of our partners in salt marsh restoration share the work that's ahead of all of us. The Mass Audubon Ecological Restoration Program is creating a statewide framework to assess salt marsh condition, trajectory, and migration potential. This tool helps guide restoration priorities, considering factors like salt marsh sparrow habitat and blue carbon storage. And just a quick fact on that, Massachusetts salt marshes contain and sequester more carbon than any other state in the Northeast because they're both extensive and in some places have very thick peat. Mass Audubon is also protecting our coastal land, taking a similar approach to what we've done farther west in the state as part of our 30 by 30 initiative, looking for biodiverse habitats, wetlands that store and sequester blue carbon, connected corridors for wetland migration, and areas that can act as buffers for water quality. More specifically, we want to take a holistic approach to our coastal ecosystems to help them maintain and regain their full potential in the face of coastal threats. For example, we can look at where salt marshes might migrate in the future and plan ahead by restoring marsh function in the short term and enabling migration in the long term by identifying restoration and protection opportunities in the future coastal landscape. One place we're doing this is by pairing salt marsh restoration projects with the restoration of coastal cranberry bogs, similar to the restoration of Tidmarsh. Mass Audubon currently has 16 active or pending restoration projects in the coastal zone, with almost 3,000 acres of coastal wetland. We're already making progress. A few of our projects focus on our coastal sanctuaries, like Barnstable Great Marsh, Rough Meadows, and Wellfleet, where we're actively working to restore the marsh and create more resilience for favorite trails, as well as provide education to the public about salt marsh restoration. We're also thinking long-term about how coastal properties can be ready for sea level rise. whether it's Daniel Webster, which, believe it or not, is one of our most vulnerable sanctuaries due to its position below current sea level, or the Chelsea Creek site that might allow us to demonstrate how urban wetlands can protect property as well as model planned retreat. We can also look seaward at the interaction between marshes, mudflats, and barrier beaches. What if we could follow nature and contribute otherwise dredged and lost sediment to our marshes and protect places like crucial barrier beaches that provide habitat for nesting birds and horseshoe crab spawning, giving them a head start to keep up with sea level rise? Right now, our ability to take some of these innovative actions is limited. We know that restoration and protection work, but we're not able to work at the pace needed. We face delays when we're permitting our restoration projects as well as implementing them. Permitting, the current regulation and permitting system makes doing beneficial wetland restoration work difficult, while allowing historic wetland degradation and destruction to remain in place, causing more damage every day. Through our campaign to accelerate wetland restoration across the Commonwealth, we're working to reduce the permitting time and cost for ecological restoration. We are also accelerating how quickly we can implement restoration work by piloting the idea of a wetlands workforce through our Salt Marsh Restoration Technician Program in partnership with Parker River National Wildlife Refuge. This past fall, 23 restoration techs and coordinators remediated over 500 ditches and restored over 1,000 acres of salt marsh in 2.5 months. With more hands on deck, we can get more of this urgent work done a lot faster. Some of our work does require even more intervention, though. To tell you more, here's Lyra Brennan, Director of our Coastal Waterbird Program.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much, Sarah. So as Sarah said, we're going to drill down a little bit more into species specifically, because when natural processes alone are not enough, we utilize intentional protection and intervention measures designed to help species persist or recover. We apply direct action when a species is threatened by habitat loss, human disturbance, development, climate change, invasive species, pollution, or really any of the other threats that we've talked about so far this evening. Our goal is to support a biodiverse coastline by working intensively with vulnerable species and the communities along the coast. I'll be highlighting some of these individual species in the slides ahead. Now, there has to be a selection process for this, and individual focal species for intervention are selected through a focused set of criteria, including the greatest conservation need. So what's the status and what are the trends of the species compared to others? An assessment of the threat landscape and existing data. In other words, what threats exist and at what level and what data supports this? The efficacy of intervention. Can we feasibly make a difference if we were to take action? And lastly, a legacy of protection by Mass Audubon, because some of the species that I'll be chatting about in a moment are a foundational part of Mass Audubon's work and have been for many, many years. You may know that there has been a staggering decline in bird species documented since 1970, along with the loss of 17 million shorebirds and 22 million waterbirds. Shorebirds and waterbirds are amongst our most imperiled species, and intervention is necessary to stop declines and identify the most effective conservation action to take right now. When we think about our coastline, it's important to remember that the needs of each species are unique, but interconnected. Wildlife need areas to forage safely, to roost and rest, and in many cases, raise their young on our coastline. This means undisturbed space, access to many different kinds of coastal habitats, and protection if they lay eggs or nest directly on the ground. We know that every species plays an important role in coastal ecosystems, and this is why we're so focused on protecting biodiversity. It's certainly not easy being a rare, threatened, or endangered coastal species because we live in a state with a highly developed coastline that has innumerable obstacles for thriving wildlife. These include active and direct threats such as predators, but also broader concerns like the ones Sarah spoke about, such as habitat loss and climate change. Threats directly contribute to the loss of individual species now and in the future, so therefore we're impacting the entire population and their sustainability. Our coastal waterbird program is a strong example of the success of active management, intervention, and the protection of coastal species. Our major objectives are to protect and conserve coastal habitats and the species that rely on them, but also to conserve coastal ecosystems through science-based management. Some of you might know that over half of the Atlantic coast population of piping plovers relies on Massachusetts. And before we move on, we're going to surprise you with a little bit of a pop quiz. If folks could take a look at the options here, and we'd like you to try and match each of these coastal waterbird focal species with the number of pairs monitored and protected by Mass Audubon in 2025. So here we have the American oystercatcher, we have least tern, and we have piping plovers. And we have 3 options for numbers: 83 pairs, 398 pairs, and 1,403 pairs. See plenty of folks taking a guess here. It's like the blue colors are eerily similar. So it looks like we have quite a few folks who so far are thinking that American oystercatchers might be the 83 pairs. And a number of folks are thinking maybe that piping plovers and least terns could be the species where we're monitoring 398 or 1,403 pairs. So great guesses. And in the next slide, I'm going to show some of these answers here, but it looks like those might have already popped up as well in the pop quiz. So thanks for participating. It's tricky, especially because we're thinking about pair numbers versus individual birds. And remember, we're not protecting all of these birds in the state. We're really protecting a percentage, and those are the numbers that you just saw. So our program covers quite a nice slice of the pie for each of these species. We protect typically 30 to 35% of the state and federally listed piping plover, 30 to 60% of the state-listed least tern, and 30% of American oystercatchers, which is a species of greatest conservation concern in Massachusetts. So you can see the numbers you just took some great guesses at here on the screen. And you'll also see on that map that we cover 205 beaches or sites and 138 miles of coastline. And we do this work using 4 primary approaches with the goal of reaching sustainable and thriving populations of each species across their breeding ground. And ultimately, we're hoping to recover each species from its listing status or its protected status. The first of these strategies is on-the-ground management, which includes work right there on the ground in the coastal environment itself, like fencing, signage, and restoration. Training and education involves bringing on 40 seasonal staff each year as they start their careers in conservation, and we provide close mentorship and training throughout their time with Mass Audubon. But we also have a number of formal and informal community education and outreach initiatives. I'll speak a little bit more about conservation research later, but our data collection and analysis provides key insights to this work. And lastly, advocacy and policy is a big part of our species intervention because that work happens on a larger scale, and it could be something like advocating for sustainable prey fish limits so that terns have enough food. And all of these approaches combined really make a positive impact for these avian species. I'm guessing it comes as no surprise that people and partnerships are essential to our success. We work with state and federal regulatory partners, municipal partners, volunteers, tribes and tribal land, other NGOs, and of course, thousands of beachgoers. And I do have to share that the seasonal staff that I just mentioned, close to 2,000 staff members have come through Mass Audubon and launched their conservation careers with us. And all of the folks here on this slide and many, many more play a role in intervening for good on behalf of coastal bird species. And it really takes a village. And the exciting part is we know that these methods work. I've attached a couple abundance graphs here on the slide for these primary species. And just a quick look tells us that American oystercatchers and plovers were nearly extirpated from the state. But all of these species have seen a promising and, in some cases, like plovers, an extraordinary recovery trend. Piping plovers have gone from 135 pairs in Massachusetts to over 1,200 pairs in 2025. And our continued monitoring and research will allow us to hone in on best practices and future interventions. We do want to play a quick video just because it's very exciting to see rare wildlife like this piping plover and chick thriving on our beaches alongside the public. So let's take a look. I'll never get over that little leg stretch. It's almost too cute. Another powerful example of our species intervention work is, of course, the rescue of cold-stunned sea turtles that strand across Cape Cod Bay in the late fall and early winter. Some of the most endangered sea turtle species in the world, like Kemp's Ridley sea turtles, become trapped in the currents of Cape Cod Bay, and the freezing temperatures become dangerous and stun them. Each year, Mass Audubon rescues hundreds of these sea turtles for rehabilitation and safe release. And with this work, we directly contribute to the persistence and survival of these species in the long run. And of course, similar to our other intervention work, partners like the New England Aquarium are critical to this effort, along with the work of hundreds of volunteers who scour the beach for turtles in very difficult weather conditions. And hopefully some of you are with us tonight. Species intervention and protection can also take the form of changes to policy through advocacy. And again, I'm guessing that many of you are familiar with our incredibly successful horseshoe crab work and campaign, which resulted in changes for a more sustainable horseshoe crab harvest, which has a direct impact on birds because horseshoe crab eggs are a critical food source for imperiled shorebirds. So tuning over to one of our other major coastal initiatives, and that would be our research and monitoring work, which asks the most pressing questions to first understand the response of indicator species to our efforts, but also to develop monitoring programs that assess the efficacy of our work. Some of these key questions for research and monitoring include, is coastal restoration effective on a species level? Which indicator species are we focused on? And are they the right indicator species? Where and what are the most substantial threats to coastal species? And what data should we be capturing to understand the status of our most vulnerable coastal habitats and species? One such indicator species is, of course, the salt marsh sparrow, for which extinction is looming as a result of flooding salt marshes. This bird nests in woven baskets of high marsh grass and presents a unique opportunity to understand the impact of our salt marsh restoration efforts. The restoration of marshes, of course, aims to preserve sufficiently elevated habitat to avoid nests and young being drowned at high tides and during storm events. Tracking salt marsh sparrow populations allows us to assess just how productive and successful our restoration work is. And at key sites, we're engaged in a banding effort to continue to study the population. This provides insights for future restoration and management efforts, especially because we here at Mass Audubon have globally significant populations of this species on our property in the Southeast. In 2025, salt marsh sparrows had a very successful year, with breeding pairs actively using and nesting in restored areas at Allen's Pond Wildlife Sanctuary. Over half of the chicks that hatched fledged, which is really, really remarkable for such an imperiled species. And you can actually see some tiny just hatched chicks here tucked into their nest. By briefly capturing and releasing adult individuals and fledges, we can take a variety of morphometric data, and by banding these birds, we can develop a picture of the population at restoration sites. And in that way, when birds are banded, if we're recapturing a bird, we get really an idea of what's there, which is super effective. Zooming out a little more broadly for a moment, Massachusetts is a critical breeding ground for many vulnerable enlisted species that I've already mentioned, but it's also a very important stopover and staging site for vast numbers of coastal birds along the Atlantic Flyway, which is pictured on the map on the left. Birds don't just rely on one part of a flyway, but instead they use everywhere from the Arctic to South America. And we're looking to answer critical questions about where birds face the most significant threats on our shores or beyond during their full life cycle so that we can mitigate and address these threats. Some threats along the flyway are pictured right here, like wind turbines and other coastal developments such as industrial power lines. And our research also seeks to understand disturbance of these species while they're here in Massachusetts. One species that demonstrates key aspects of our full life cycle research effort is, of course, the federally endangered roseate tern and our Mass Audubon logo. This is a species that breeds here in Massachusetts, and it's informally known as the world's most beautiful tern. And about 90% of the endangered Northwest Atlantic population breeds here on only 3 islands, which raises concerns about population redundancy and resilience. But remember, this species is only here for a few months and spends the rest of the year on its migratory journey or down in South America. On the north coast of Brazil, we collaborate closely with partners to mitigate the largest single-source mortality for Northwest Atlantic roseate terns in the hemisphere by reducing power line collisions. So we're doing super effective work on the wintering grounds that directly allows survival of these birds. And we also tag roseate terns with GPS tags to learn more about their migratory pathways, which is what you see on this map, the sort of colorful strings. Those are the journeys of individual roseate terns leaving Brazil and heading up to their breeding grounds here with us. And understanding those exact migratory pathways will help us see how they travel through wind energy areas and allow us to calculate other risks along the flyway. Our research also looks closely at these 2 birds here, the first being the willet, which is a marsh breeding bird in Massachusetts whose population happens to be doing very well, and this is the bird on the left. On the other hand, we have whimbrel, which is a neotropical shorebird that breeds in the Arctic, but its populations are drastically declining. Whimbrel rely on our salt marshes during their migratory journey to feed on fiddler crabs. So by comparing the 2 species and studying them, our research will answer key questions on their long-term population viability, including where are we losing birds? Why are willet doing so well and whimbrel struggling to survive? What can we do to support these species? And again, technology is needed to answer these questions. We tagged willets with GPS tags to capture their post-breeding movement across New England and beyond. So you can see some of those fun, colorful journeys on the map here on the left. And these tracks show us everything from critical feeding grounds to wintering habitat, allowing us to understand how birds are moving and what they might need. And of course, the Manomet Center for Conservation Science and additional international partners are essential for this effort. I'll provide one last example of our research and monitoring program that includes long-term protection, monitoring, and research across the beautiful Boston Harbor Islands. Along with our suite of partners, we monitor the nesting and productivity of breeding birds that rely on this unique drowned drumlin ecosystem, such as gulls and black-crowned night heron, pictured in the lower right image, and both of these are experiencing notable decline. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Sarah for her to speak more about landscape scale research and monitoring.
At the landscape level, every site that we restore is monitored before and after restoration. It's a process, not just a project. And adaptive management is crucial. We're also working with partners across the state to monitor salt marshes long-term and before and after restoration as part of the Mass Marsh Advisory Committee. We're all working together to use the same methods across the state, so data on vegetation, hydrology, and other metrics can be compared, and we can better understand the efficacy of our restoration methods and the way our marshes function and respond. We also work together with other organizations to share the crucial mission of restoring and protecting our coasts, modeling this through our work leading the collaborative Cape and Islands Restoration Action Team, with partners like the Association to Preserve Cape Cod, the Center for Coastal Studies, and trustees of reservations. And we participate in groups like the SMART teams that guide restoration practices and the Massachusetts Salt Marsh Working Group, where we share the latest research and data. Despite urgent threats to our coast, there is hope through our collective action. It's important to remember that our coastal environment is a dynamic continuum that spans from estuarine headwaters to subtidal habitats. If we want to make an impact, we need to think holistically and work together. And now I will turn things back to Jocelyn Forbush.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and also Lyra. Wonderful to hear about all of this work, and also what a decisive moment this is for our Massachusetts coast. What an important moment. And I know that my gratitude for your leadership and everything you and colleagues bring to Mass Audubon is shared by our listeners here tonight. Just extraordinary expertise, depth of knowledge, and also tremendous opportunity for you to share that with us. So thank you. I am certainly inspired in hearing Sarah and Lyra talk about the really integrated and reinforcing strategies that Mass Audubon is mobilizing all along the coast. We know that due to the complexity of this challenge, we need to work across all of the disciplines and use all of the tools and approaches that are at our disposal to address these issues. You heard a little bit about policy, about research, about land protection, ecological restoration, about bird conservation. But of course, there is even more. We did not have enough space in tonight's program to dig into, of course, the amazing community engagement, the education efforts that our sanctuaries and that our education teams have underway in support of our coast, all along our coast, across that network. And we'll save that for a next webinar. And meanwhile, we'll absolutely encourage all of you to get out to our amazing coastal sanctuaries for a visit, or encourage you to engage in one of our terrific programs. Of course, there's nothing like the coast in the wintertime. What a beautiful and spectacular sight. I do hope that you take from our presentation this evening that there is really critical and important work ahead, but also that we at Mass Audubon are undaunted. And in fact, we're excited for the challenge, and we are doubling down on our coastal focus. I want to thank you all for being on this journey with us tonight. And I also want to turn from here and spend a little bit of time at the end of our presentation to answer some questions. And in particular, I know we have a few that came in through the live chat, and we also had a tremendous number of interesting questions that came into us through your original signup. So nice to see, hi Lyra and Sarah back here with us on the screen. And we have we'll go through a handful of questions that we can sort of share between the two of them. First of which I'm going to ask Sarah to answer, which is really to discuss rising sea level, which of course was voted #1 as our most worried threat. So how, Sarah, does this affect different areas? So sea level is not happening equally everywhere. So how does this impact us differently depending on where you are along the coast?
Right. So we know that sea levels are rising globally. But what's interesting is that local sea level rise is different depending on where you are along the coast. And this person mentioned the Pacific, and there are actually places along the Pacific coast where local sea level is actually going down due to geologic reasons. But here on the Atlantic coast, particularly in New England, our sea levels are rising faster than the global average. And what's interesting for Massachusetts is that we have 2 tidal ranges. On the north side of the Cape, it's called a mesotidal environment. So we have a much higher tidal range than we do on the south side, which is a microtidal environment. So that has a much lower tidal range. And so as sea level is rising, the areas on the south side of the state actually have less room of water level that they've adapted to accommodating. So we're expecting that as sea level rise occurs, some of our more vulnerable areas are going to be in that microtidal environment compared to the mesotidal environment on the north side.
That's great. Thank you. And I'll just respond to, there's a question about whether salt marsh restoration can help with rising sea levels. And I think as you hear Sarah talking about really needing to understand exactly where you are in the landscape, the seascape, to know what sea level is like in that area really drives the specifics of the design of an ecological restoration project. So they can be quite different depending where you are. So thank you for that, Sarah. Our next question, this is going over to Lyra. What has been the breeding success rate trend for piping plovers in the state versus the Atlantic coast versus globally? This is from Stuart in Norwell. And Lyra, before you dive into that, we've also got a live chat question, which is what's the most helpful initiative to help plovers make such a great recovery? So both the where are we in Massachusetts versus our Atlantic coast and globally, and then what's the key? What's the key to success that we've learned here in Massachusetts?
What's the magic recipe? Well, great questions. As you all saw, the success of breeding piping plovers in Massachusetts has been exceptional, unprecedented. And the way that the species is looked at is through different population groupings. We have the Atlantic coast population of piping plovers, the Great Lakes, and the Great Plains. So just focusing on the Atlantic coast, if we look at the coast as a whole, New England is standing out with high productivity and a lot of success. And the Southern Recovery Unit, the New York, New Jersey Recovery Unit, and the Canadian Recovery Unit are really, really struggling. In some places, piping plover populations are lower than they were when the species was federally listed. So we have some really concerning patterns happening in a number of states, whereas in New England right now, we are in an unprecedented state of growth. It's not to say that many folks are not putting in their heart and soul to the work. And there are some things we know. There are some things we understand as to why the birds are doing so well in Massachusetts. We know we have really great food sources here in Massachusetts. And we also have plovers in Massachusetts that seem just fine with one foraging opportunity. And what I mean by that is plovers here in Massachusetts are okay if they just have high ocean energy foraging out on the outer Cape or perhaps on the North Shore. They just have that outer beach. But in other states, we see that plovers are really relying on having both quiet bayside foraging and that high energy coastal foraging environment. And here in Massachusetts, we're not seeing that requirement in the same way. And so what's really exciting is trying to pull out the threads of why plovers are doing so well here, and continuing to learn and do research and put our best foot forward. And also to think about how we can apply tools that we know here to other places in order to try and get the entire population in a better place. So interestingly enough, our population is really in a different spot than some of our partners, and we're looking to really expand those partnerships and expand that research so that we can bring everybody up to that really good place.
That's great. So tune in as Lyra, who is really with the Coastal Waterbird program here in Massachusetts and other partners who work in this program as well. I should mention Mass Audubon is one of several who are focused on this work. Really lead our eastern seaboard in trying to lift the species off of its listing, right, into healthy and vibrant populations. So we're really outsized in our importance at this moment here in Massachusetts for plover and really the cohort of species that occupy the space. Okay, next question. How has the strategy evolved given the current political environment? And I think we can think about this both from the federal administration changes that have impacted us in the last several months, as well as our state environment. Who am I handing this over to? I think to Lyra, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, please.
This is so important to think about because from our perspective here at Mass Audubon, it makes our work even more important and urgent than it was before. It's always been critical to protect these coastal habitats, to support these species, but now we're all experiencing times where resources are short, where we had an example or leadership that perhaps we don't have anymore. Resources are changing. And so being able to carry forth this puts even more of that oversized responsibility that Jocelyn just mentioned with us at the table. And so we have the opportunity now to kind of set the example and say that right now we're able to focus on all of these. Here are the best practices. And also, how can we help our friends and partners who are struggling in this moment and come together to accomplish some of these conservation initiatives. And those partnerships and those collaborations are such a key part of the work that we do.
That's great. I think that's a great summary. We have a huge network and opportunity of NGOs, of state, of public, and some of our federal partners are still able to do the work that they're doing. So we're very hopeful that continues in places that it does. We're advocating in the places where it's not. And as Lyra said, it's really this is the moment where state organizations and our state administration play an outsized role once again in carrying the water in ways perhaps we didn't anticipate. Next question. I'm interested to know if municipal governments have been involved. So we talked about federal and state. So how have our local towns and cities been involved in our coastal work broadly? So thank you, Paul C. from Norwood. And Sarah, help us understand in particular from the perspective of the ecological restoration work, how are you engaging with municipal governments and how are they activating towards these issues?
Yeah, well, we have a great project going on right now that is focused directly on working with a few different municipal governments on the Cape. We are working with the towns of Barnstable, Dennis, and Eastham to identify salt marsh restoration projects in those towns, led by those towns with our assistance. And so we've gone through a great process of visiting different marshes in each town and thinking about what projects would not only make the best restoration projects, but which ones make the most sense to go along with other coastal resiliency projects that those towns are already working on. So that's been a great success. And the land, our marshes, you may be surprised to know that many of them are owned by towns. So as we are approaching restoration projects, many of those town-owned lands become a very crucial puzzle piece in restoring large areas of marsh.
It's great.
I think Lyra also had something to say
Yeah,
about
Lyra, do you want
municipal
to talk a little
government
bit about the
partnership as
role of
well.
towns with the Coastal Waterbird Program?
Sure. I'll just add to and really echo what Sarah was saying is that towns have been an essential part of the effort. I mean, these are our coastal landowners, and they're extremely dedicated to stewarding these landscapes into the future. And we have, partnerships with nearly or 50 towns across the state, everywhere, North Shore, South Shore, you name it. And so they have been incredible partners and do a lot for rare species, and that includes not just avian species, but in all the turtle rescue, all of these efforts are happening across municipal landscapes.
Yeah, great. As Sarah and Lyra have said throughout the program, the partnerships that we have and at the local level are spectacular, also regional and state, but we couldn't do it without our municipal partners. And as importantly, as Sarah said and Lyra said, oftentimes this is land, a lot of this land along the coast, a great deal is owned by Mass Audubon, by other NGOs, by the state, but a lot is owned by our municipalities. So really important for us to share stewardship approaches and partner as they've both described. Um, I think we're on to our maybe last question. And there's a few of these that are resonating in the chat as well. Many of you submitted a question in advance, basically around how can we help? And so I can talk a little bit about this. And there are a number of different directions and approaches depending on what your interest level is. So first of all, and I see at least one question or one note in the live chat around volunteering, and for example, the sea turtle program that Lyra mentioned, and honestly, most of the other both science and sanctuary programs that we operate could benefit from volunteers of a range of expertise and interests. So volunteering at Mass Audubon is both fun and interesting and collaborative, but it's also extraordinarily impactful. You can go to our website, www.massaudubon.org, and there is a volunteer portal, and through that you will have the opportunity to be connected in to volunteer opportunities. The other way to do this is to connect with a sanctuary. If you are near one and you visit, you can reach out and connect with staff on site. So that's a spectacular way to get involved. Another way many people choose to get involved is as an advocate and to engage in these issues, whether that's locally, whether it's at the state level. Can be everything from reaching out to your local legislators when there's an advocacy alert that goes out from our Mass Audubon team. So you can sign up for those, I believe, also on our website. Learn about issues and take, those phone calls make a huge difference as far as mobilizing our elected leaders to drive change. And we also have a program called Climate and Nature Champions. So you can join in with what is currently thousands of other Mass Audubon friends in working on issues of climate and biodiversity across the state. So being an advocate takes many forms and would invite you to do that. Also would love for you all to support this work. So many of you who are joining us tonight are members, are funders, are supporters. This is critical. You see the dimensions of this work, the breadth of the work, the depth of the work. We love that you're members. If you're not, please join. If your friends are not, please encourage them to do so. Get them involved. And if you are already a member, we encourage you to increase your investment, specifically focused on coastal work or more broadly, just in support of Mass Audubon's efforts overall. And finally, I would say just get outside and enjoy the coast. Come to our sanctuaries, be part of these places. I love the poll at the very first slide about the sounds and the sights and the feel of our coast. Just an unbelievably special place. And so encourage you to share that enjoyment with us at our sanctuaries. I think with that, we will wrap. We are really thrilled to have had you all with us tonight. I want to thank Lyra and Sarah again, both in sharing with us this evening, but also for the tremendous work that you do day to day, and also the work that you represent behind you with all of your team members and your colleagues. So thank you. And thank you all to all of you who are here tonight, whether emojis or otherwise. We love your inspiration. It keeps us going, keeps us lifted up, and we look forward to connecting with you in the future and further future programs. So thank you, and have a great night.